This is Nathan.
All right, welcome everyone to JavaScript Lunch and Learn. Thanks, Nathan, for talking to us about containerizing applications. And thanks to everyone on YouTube watching and everyone who made it in first. Go ahead.
Right, so thanks everyone for coming. And this is going to be DockerCompose, which are small steps to a better DX. Does anyone know what DX is? Developer experience. A lot of people that forget to make the developers happy. So this is going to be geared towards that developer experience. I can definitely do a future talk about battle hardening the Docker file. We're going to go up, make it fix the security vulnerabilities. So we're going to go into it, and also kind of how this plays very nicely into CI/CD. And it's going to be for both. If you've never touched Docker, we're going to start from some of the small steps that I use, but also people that have used it. Hopefully you can get some things out of this, because there's a lot of things that I've learned over the past 5 years I've been using Docker. So I'm Nathan. I'm a principal software engineer at a company called b.well Connected Health, based out of Baltimore, and we make personalized healthcare experience. But I grew up in Birmingham. I moved back a year ago, basically now, maybe a year and a couple months. I'm very happy to be back. I don't have a social media presence, so if you want to follow on GitHub or hit me up on LinkedIn, these are the 2 links to it. I'll share those slides, I'm sure, after this. So what is Docker? So Docker is an open source containerization platform. What it allows you to do is package your app code with all your dependencies, with the OS libraries and dependencies that run it, so that you can run what you're building in any environment, anytime. Doesn't matter what the operating system is, if it's Windows, Mac, Linux, doesn't matter what the cloud environment you're running on, if it's AWS, if it's GCP, you can run it anywhere. So that's what it's made for, and it's beautiful. So kind of the history of how it got started, 20 years ago, people were just running it on bare metal. So if you were setting up your local computer, your setup for your PHP might be a little different than your coworkers, which is going to be different than what's running on the on-prem server. And you get a lot of mismatches between, versioning and different libraries that get put into it that you might not think about. And so people were like, well, this sucks. Like, let's come up with something better. So people came up with VM. So, things like VirtualBox and Vagrant. And the big difference that I want to highlight is this piece. The virtual machines, they have to run their own operating system in order for them to be able to run. And so what that means is it has to allocate a ton of memory that's always going to be running out of the box, and it's also going to take up a lot more disk. And so somewhere, I don't remember when Docker came out, but let's say 2013, 2014, people say, wait a second, what if we abstract that away and still use a lot of the stuff on your host OS, but we give you the ability to pick the distribution that you want to run and package all your stuff. So that's how Docker kind of came to light. So the reasons that I love Docker, the first one I already talked about was portability. And everybody's heard, oh, it worked on my machine, why is it not working? Docker, I'm not going to say it knocks it out 100% of the time, but you hear it a lot less. Between your local environment, you can generate one image that you can then have different configuration environment variables for develop, staging, production, testing, anything that you can think of. But also, as I talked about earlier, if you've got a newcomer coming into your company to work on the same product, all you have to do is say, here, Docker Compose up, and bam, you've got yourself up and running with however many dependencies you might have. Doesn't matter if they're running on Linux or Windows or Mac. Docker really shines in microservice architecture, as we're going to get into a little bit when we do the live demo. But it works with monoliths. So I've actually had people quit because they could not get their local environment set up before we Dockerize stuff. They'd have to download one version of MySQL, and the README didn't say it, what the new version was, and they'd try to get Python running with 2.7 instead of 3, and the list goes on. Docker fixes that problems for you. And lastly, the CI/CD that you get from being able to generate these images and containers makes it so that you can deploy with the flip of a switch as long as you have the image already built. And the image building is quick, depending on what you're doing, but we can get into that a little more later. So what I always like to do to start out, for anybody that isn't familiar with Docker, is comparing it to object-oriented programming. So the four things that I use all the time, and you will use if you use Docker, are images, containers, volumes, and the network. So the images are the thing, I always compare them to classes. So they are, these abstract things that say what I want to build, like everything that's going to go into it, be it, if it's for Node, what the Node version is, any sort of files that I might want to go in there. Maybe I want to add some public-private keys to connect to Mongo or whatever it is. That's the stuff that you generate in the image that I call the class. Container is probably the more important part, and it's an instance of that class. So you can have, let's pretend that the image is a car. You can have Toyota, and you can have Honda. Or you could have multiple instances of a Toyota running at once. So I like to call them instances of a class. The volumes, if you remember, for containers, they're ephemeral. They can disappear at any time. Oh, please, go for it. And so if you want to persist things, then that's what the Docker volumes are for. So I liken that to the file system. If you're making changes to a text file or whatever, or you want to save something to disk, that's what the volume is. And the network is kind of where this analogy falls apart. It's the containers talking to each other. So if you can generate two instances of some class, like how are they going to communicate? And that's what the network allows you to do. So what is DockerCompose? This talk is not going to be about Kubernetes or Docker Swarm or anything like that. This is about local container orchestration. I know somebody else has given a talk a couple weeks or months about Kubernetes. We use Kubernetes at my spot, and it's great. We can talk about overkill and whatnot, but DockerCompose is fantastic for local development. And when you combine it with something like a makefile, it makes life super simple for local development. And that's what we want, is to make it so anybody can get up and running and be contributing code within a day. That's my goal when new people join. Here's just a sample Docker file that we're going to get back to, but what I always like to do is actually do some live coding. So what I have done is I borrowed a library I found on the internet that's a pretty rinky-dink Node app that uses Mongo in the background. And the great thing about Docker is it doesn't care what you use. So if you want to swap out Mongo for, is this big enough? You can swap out any sort of dependencies that you want, and that's what we're going to do. So we are going to Dockerize this application, and I've been doing this. What you're going to learn here doesn't matter if it's Node. You can use the same steps for a PHP app. I've done it. Ruby on Rails app. I've done it. Django app. I've done it. Doesn't matter. It works the same. So we're going to start out by just seeing what we get out of the box before Dockerizing it. And so this is another thing. Like if I don't have this Dockerized, I need to tell everybody like, oh yeah, go download Mongo, have it running locally, make sure the port's clear. And I forgot to do that for this thing. So I have a different Mongo thing running somewhere, or not right here. So I'm gonna say DockerCompose up, and we're gonna get back to this. Don't worry. But this is just to get my little Mongo shell running. And once it gets running, we will start it up again. There we go. All right, so now Mongo's running. So start this puppy one more time. Live coding's always a little scary because you can always break stuff. That's what I want. Okay, one more time. There we go. So if we look at this beautiful app, that I don't take any credit for. We have a shark thing, and we can add sharks that are going to be stored on the Mongo piece. And you can see that this existing Mongo instance that I have already has some of these sharks. I've played around with this. Well, what we want to do is make it so that anybody can download, git, clone this repo, and run one command to spin this up. And what we're going to do is start by doing a Docker file to create that base image. And then we're going to go into DockerCompose file so we can add the database. And then if we have time, we're going to add a couple extra things like maybe Rabbit or Redis or something to make this a little more interactive. And please, if you have any questions as I'm going, please stop, because that'll make it a little more involved. So let's start with the Docker file. So I am going to create my Docker file, and I'm going to zoom in because I bet that's probably hard to see too. And we're going to go over and we're going to play around in it. So the first thing that you always need to add is the base image. For Node, which this is, you always say, Node, and what version you want and what distribution you want. So I'm just going to start with 14. I think it's Alpine. I think this is the right thing. And so what this is saying is, hey, go up to Docker, the Docker Hub, Docker Registry, and give me all the different versions that are out there. So if I look at this, this is the node, which is the first part of this command, and then these are the tags. So this is saying, I'm saying I want to use 14 Alpine. You might be saying, what's the difference between Alpine and Stretch and Buster and Bullseye? And all the differences is it's the distribution underlying, Linux distribution underlying the image. So I've just been using 14, so we're going to use 14. So the next thing I'm going to do, just to show you what this gives us, is we are actually going to launch into it after it's done downloading. So as I said, the image is a class, and so we want to build a container that is the instance of that class. And so I'm going to tell Docker to build a new image based off that Docker file that I told it to use. So that's kind of our class template. And I'm going to give it a tag. I'm going to call it, been calling it Docker Toots. I think I've already spelled this out. I'm giving it a version of 0.0.1. And then the only other important part is what's the current path. So I'm saying in my current directory, use it. Now, in the future, you might have more complicated Docker file setups, and you'll have different Docker file names. So you can specify what the Docker file name is. So like you might have a production one, you might have one that's for local builds, but you don't need to specify it. So what it's doing is it's going to pull down Alpine node 14 if it hasn't done it already, but I already have, so I see that it pulled the cached version. I'm going to set the entry point, which I said bin bash. And so I have all these in the README for people that want to play along. But the first thing that I want to do is I want to spin up a container using that image that I just created, giving it a new container name. And what's going to be a little different is I don't want to expose anything right now. I just want to show you what is there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say Docker run. We want to remove this container after we start it because we don't want it laying around. Interactive, because I want to go into that container. I'm going to give it a name of Docker Toots test removal because it's going to die after I close my shell. And I need to tell it the tag name, which I think I just, yeah, exactly what it is. So Docker Toots 0.0.1. We'll see what happens. So notice my shell now looks a little different. That's because I am no longer on my host machine. I am inside the container. And if I do an ls, I get, with this Node Alpine distribution, a lot of the niceties that you'd be used to playing around on any sort of Linux distribution or OS. So what happens if I go crazy and I say, you know what, I hate all the users on this container? Is that going to nuke my machine? Am I going to lose all the users on mine? Exactly. It's going to nuke the container. So now that's gone, but I don't have to worry about me losing stuff on my machine because I haven't set the volumes, which we're going to get into in a little bit. So everything that lives on the container without setting volumes is gone as soon as you stop the container. But this is a node container. I just got rid of the user stuff so you can't see it anymore. But I could run node and it would start up, or npm or whatever.
Yeah, sorry, stop it up. Could you make that a little bit larger? Is it all right if I kill the other lights here?
Yeah, I'm good. You can kill all the lights you want.
So, Andrew Spears watching this online. Well, that's really dark. Maybe check it out. I think that's going to be the rest of it again. All right. Sorry, Andrew.
If I knew how to switch this to light mode, I would, but I don't.
The dark one actually shows up.
Okay, good. So I'm going to exit out of that container, and if we look at the container list, it's not going to be there. This is the other database I got running. So what we want to do now is, now that we have played around, is we want to set up this container so that it takes this repo with all these files, copies them into the container, and then gives it the ability to spin up that node instance to run the server. So there's a couple steps that are always baseline. The first one is setting a working directory inside the container. Depending on what language you're using and what image base, people have different ones. I generally just go with app, but you'll see home app, you'll see var, HTML, you'll see all sorts of things. But all I'm saying is, from this point forward, everything inside the container is going to go inside the app directory. Create it and go in there. The first thing you do with Node is you copy your stuff from your host machine. So with Docker, in order for things that go host to container, it's always host first, then container. So I'm saying copy anything. I want to copy my package JSON stuff, and I want to copy it into app. Since I said working directory is app, I'm just telling it to copy it right there. Then once I have that, I'm going to tell it to run something. I'm going to say install these packages. So I have Express and NodeMon and some other things that make it a little easier to run this locally. I'm telling it to run them. A lot of people ask, why would you not just copy your node modules directly from your host machine onto the container? And the reason is my host machine operating system is going to be different than this Linux operating system. So when an npm installs some stuff, there might be different versions that it pulls in based off that. So we could get something that wouldn't run, and you don't want to override it. So that's why, and there's actually another point that's going to be very similar to that with volumes that I'll bring up in a little bit. So that's going to install everything. And so lastly, we just want to copy everything over and exposing a port, which you don't have to do, but this is basically saying, I'm running on port 3000. This is the port that I want you to expose. So I'm copying all files after I run the npm install over into my container, and let's start there and let's see what happens. So I have to build it again. So notice one cool thing that Docker does is if you've already done it, it caches the response, so it's pretty zippy. If I were to change something here, make a new command here, it would still cache these, but everything afterwards would be new. And you can also say, don't use anything you've done already. Let's start fresh. I don't trust any of the crap that I've already made. So I'd say no cache. And notice it's doing the npm install inside the container.
Yeah, so you guys can copy everything. Does that mean that node modules got copied and that's copy dot.
It does, and I'm glad you brought that up. When I get into the DockerCompose file, I'll show you how to fix that. So let's go back into the container one more time and make sure that the app is there. And notice that this time I went directly into app because that's where I said the working directory is. And if I look in the files, these are all the same files that I have locally. Now, what happens if I were to, I don't know. So this would be an instance like I might have to go into my image or my Docker file and apt-get, or I guess apk get vim if I wanted to edit stuff in here. But the question was more, if I were to edit this package.json file in this container, would it affect my host machine? It would not, because I've not set up any of the volumes. So there's no bidirectional communication right now. But Node is here, 14.17.5 version, and if I were to, do npm run dev, it would boot, but it's not going to connect to the localhost container. The localhost 27017 for Mongo, because I'm now in this container. The localhost is no longer my host machine's localhost, so it can't talk to Mongo. So that is where we are going to switch into the DockerCompose. So instead of trying to spend a lot of time generating this, I'm actually just going to copy it, and we're going to walk through every single piece of it, because I made it last night and it takes a while. And DockerCompose is one of those things, like, you do it project setup and you like update it over time, but you don't do it that often, so it's just kind of hard to remember how to do it off the top of your head. And we'll add stuff to it because I think we're going to have time. So I've created my DockerCompose, and I'm actually just going to copy this puppy right here because I want to. So DockerCompose. We're going to run through every single piece of this. I'm missing the version. And talk about everything that's in here and some of the things that are also missing that I probably add for stuff that's more involved. But version of the DockerCompose file, I think they're up to like 3.9 or something. DockerCompose, again, is great for local development. Nobody really uses it for container orchestration in the cloud, so your mileage may vary, but I'm a big fan. So the services are all the things that we want to have this app running. We know that we need Mongo to make sure that we can still add sharks to this thing. So if I do it right now, I can't. So I'm saying I define these names. So I say this one's called Docker Toots, and we also have the database that's the Mongo instance. So this is the name, and everything underneath it are commands that are respective to this DockerCompose service. So this I don't actually need, but as you get a more complex application, you're going to have, mono repo or Git submodules or something where you'll have different microservices that you might have broken out, or you'll have a MySQL instance with a custom Docker file because it's 5.3 and you have to do a bunch of stuff to it. So that's what this allows you to do. But this is saying, use this current directory that I'm in, and to build this class, use this Docker file. That's all it's saying. Container name, also optional. DockerCompose will generate one for you, but I like to be explicit, so that's what I am doing here. Restart, also not required, but it's nice just to know if it fails, it'll at least try to restart, and you can go back and try to figure out what's going on. I'm giving it this environment variable, this environment file to connect to the Mongo instance. And so I'm telling the DockerCompose that use this environment file as this .env that I've created. And then the only things that you're going to inject into the container runtime is you set the Mongo port and the MongoDB to what's in the environment, the .env file. And then I'm explicitly saying this is the host name. And I'm going to get into networks in a second. So these are the two places I see a lot of people get hung up. So if I were to take this out, what would happen is this would boot fine, and it would connect to the database because they're connected on this app network, but I would not be able to access it from my machine. So the ports are saying, map from my host machine to the container. Anything on my machine that's port 3000, I want you to forward to this container that I exposed in the Docker file, port 3000. 9229, if anybody knows what that's for, and Node. Debugging. It's what the debugger port runs on by default. So without that, you couldn't stop execution and play around with debugger. You could use console logs, but I find it a lot easier to do debugger. So I always add those, and if I wanted to say 3000 is taken, maybe 3030, then I would log in on my machine to 3030, and it would point to 3000 on Docker. It's a little confusing, but most of the time you just keep them static. Volumes. So your question about node module. Yes, it would have overwritten it if the last time I built it. But what you do is you specify a volume that you give it a volume directory, and you say, point this node modules thing that I've defined down here, make sure that it doesn't overwrite anything in app node modules. Like, that's my node modules is going to point back to my machine and this Docker volume that I've named node modules, and not the one that is mounted in this current build context. So I don't know if I did a good job of explaining that.
So you just say it should go to a bind.
Yes. So that's one way of doing it. The other way that I see done a lot is you don't actually define the bind mount. You just say, leave this open. Don't let what I'm copying override what's already in there. So those are the two options. But I like this one better. I don't know why. It just feels, I like to be very explicit with what's going on versus leaving it to guesswork. The last thing is the app network. So by default, Docker creates the Docker network, and if you don't specify anything, it will use the Docker network, and that's how things will communicate with each other over the Docker network. And in the DockerCompose file, that is via the container name. So if I say MongoDB instead of localhost, I would say DB. And that's what I've set up in this env. If I were to change it to MongoDB, then I would need to change it to MongoDB in my environment. Does that make sense with the localhost and the networking? Okay. And then lastly, I'm going to get back to this. I'm just going to go over the DB real quick. The great thing about running DockerCompose is, like, if I Google Mongo DockerCompose text YAML, there's going to be like one that's like 3 lines, and you can run DockerCompose up and just start it by default. So for this one, honestly, all I would need is this, or I don't need, this is all I need. I just need these 3, however many lines that is, to get this running and working correctly. These other things that I've added, we've talked about most of them already. Explicit container name, restart by default, and use the environment file if you want. And if you have something like, for SQL Pro, if you wanted to connect to it on your host machine, Mongo would be Compass. You want to be able to connect to it to your machine, so that's why I set the port. And then volumes, same thing. I'm creating a bind mount to, it's like, I don't remember, var lib docker. I'm creating one db data, and I'm mapping what Mongo would normally use as data db to house all its data. So that is a lot. Oh, yeah. So the last thing I need to talk about is wait for it. So every DockerCompose setup has had this issue in the past where if I say DockerCompose up, the node module is going to start up before the database is going to be done. And DockerCompose has a way to wait for Mongo to be done first, but it's not good. So somebody made this wait for it shell command script, and that's exactly what it does. You just give it, what TCP thing I'm listening to on what port, and then I'll run the next command after I get like a health check, basically. So I always set this up in every single project that I start with DockerCompose. And it's pretty simple. The only thing that you got to remember to do is, since it's an executable, is change the permissions on it to be an executable. So 007 if you want, but and if I look at the permissions on it now, lo and behold, it can do whatever it wants. So let's go back and just double check everything. We got our DockerCompose. Instead of running the shell, what we'd like to do is run npm run dev. And this will actually override it, but if you just want to run it from the container, like Docker container instead of DockerCompose, this would work too. And I think I changed the environment variable to DB. So I believe if I kill this Docker, this Mongo instance, and I look at what I currently have running, it's exited. So that means I should be able to just say Docker compose up. And you'll see me interchangeably use Docker -compose and Docker -compose because Docker recently, in their most recent version, added Docker compose by default. So they do the same thing. Let's see what happens. No such service. Rabbit. Okay, I need to kill these old containers. I was playing with this earlier and I added rabbit. So Docker container prune. So I just killed everything. So let's try it again. So we're creating our app network that we took down when we did DockerCompose down. Now it's creating our DockerTooth service and our DB service. And this is just all the logs that are spitting out. But notice the DockerTooths went after DB and it's listening on port 3000. Then if I go back to localhost 3000, lo and behold, it's running from the container and you have your normal invariable niceties. Let me kill this. Like if I want to, double check. Hello from container, save it, restart, boom, almost instantaneous. So yeah, I got enough time. So this is a simple project, but as the project grows, you're going to break stuff out. You're going to want to add Redis. You're going to want to add Memcache or Rabbit or Kafka or whatever. So the old times, you would go to Kafka, download the executable, install it, have it running, make sure that it's the same version that the people are using on that's defined in whatever pip file or whatever you have, and make sure that every time your computer turns off that it starts up, because otherwise you're going to forget about it and then like, why is my streaming shit not working? Pardon my French. So what DockerCompose does is it says, no. Let's make this easy. Let's make the developer experience a fun thing. So like I said earlier, you can just Google DockerCompose RabbitMQ, and if I just click on it and I go copy this, I'm gonna have to change a couple things. I'll show you what. Perfect. So also using Alpine. So this is the RabbitMQ image. It sets the container name to RabbitMQ for me. I love that. Nicely done. It's exposing the ports that Rabbit runs on and also that the admin panel runs on. And this stuff, since I don't care about persistence for my queuing system right now, I'm going to get rid of those. And obviously, I need to change my network to be the same as my other network. And, okay, so all I should have to do now is stop the current Docker Compose, build it up again. Notice it's creating RabbitMQ. And as soon as that's done, and this would be another one I'd add, like if my node thing needed Rabbit to start before it started, that'd be another, like I'd say wait for the DB on 27017 and localhost 5672 or whatever. So RabbitMQ is running, and if I go to localhost 5th, yeah, lo and behold, now I got Rabbit running. Bam, instant. Didn't have to worry about anything. So that's in a nutshell why I love Docker Compose and Docker. So I think the only last thing I have are my final thoughts. And I just found this thing out. Like, honestly, it was either early this week or late last week. Somebody added this. Oh, it wouldn't even let me load it. Well, it worked earlier. But what it is it like automatically generated Docker Compose stuff. I don't even see it anymore. I'll fix it. I'll find where it was. But you basically say, I have a Python app or a Node app. I want to have MySQL. I want to have Memcache. I want to have like much stuff, and it automatically generate the Docker Compose, which is pretty cool. So you don't even have to go through the motions of trying to write these things for yourself, but they're mostly already on the internet, as you saw with me copying RabbitMQ. And the last thing that I want to say is this Docker file would work on production, but I would not feel comfortable releasing it. There's a lot of security holes in it. It's probably a little bigger than I'd like. I might even go with something a little slimmer if I can to make it so instead of being, let's see, this one I think is like 100 megabytes. Like you can make it, you probably trim it down to, I don't know, 20, maybe 50. Which just makes it easier for spinning up for the CI/CD purpose and starting new stuff. Yeah.
Andrew's asking online, why is the compose wait utility here?
So when people tried to use it, like I don't know, 3 years ago, a lot of times it didn't properly wait on for the correct health check, so it would spin up the node instance even before Mongo would be done. I don't know if they fixed it, but everything that I've seen still, this is what people use. But it would be worthy of something to Google and find out if wait for is useless now. But I'm set in my ways.
So on the Kubernetes side, we use wait all the time because they proliferated, right, the number of probes with the startup probe and the readiness probe, liveness probe. So it usually works pretty well, especially when working with packages like helm charts. But I mean, there's several things, right, where people want to wait for using Docker Compose for production.
Yeah. A good question.
Thanks, Andrew.
So honestly, that is all I have. Does anybody else have questions, comments, concerns, criticisms?
Get the repo.
Yes. I put it in here, and the first branch, I'll go to it. The first branch is where we started, and then I have either a tag or a branch that's with the Docker added. But it doesn't have RabbitMQ, but that's it would be a good exercise to play around in. What other questions?
So when you're editing or you're, does it rebuild in the background so you know, like you're using node mod or something?
As long as you have your volume set up to copy over like this. So I'm saying on my host machine, everything in my current directory, copy into the app working directory that I specified in this this image file. Set up that bind mount so that there's bidirectional communication. If you do that, then anytime, you know, like for instance with NodeMon, or if you're doing another language, I mean, I don't remember what it is for Python, but every time I make a change, it's going to rebuild and start the server again. Yes. Now, editing the Docker file, that's not automated. That's so like if you need to make a change, you know, for like, I think a good example was I wanted to edit the file in the host machine, or sorry, in the container, but I couldn't because Vim wasn't installed by default on Node Alpine 14. So like an example for that would be like, you know, Node Alpine, Docker Node Alpine add Vim. I don't remember what the APK command for that is, but let's see, blah, 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 blah. This app APK, here we go. So if I want to, they even show it right here. If I wanted to make it so that I could Vim the files, I don't know why I would, but maybe you do. Then I would say, oh yeah, as part of this build, what I need you to do is update the APK and add Vim. So if I then do DockerCompose, I think it's also no cache. I don't remember. Let's find out. Yeah, I think it's just going to start it. So I have to say DockerCompose build no cache. There we go. So notice the APK, adding Vim, installing, and if I It's the Alpine distribution. It's the same thing as apt-get if you're running Buster. Huh?
The Debian?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I think so, but let's find out. So if I want to go into the shell, I have these aliased, but if I wanted to go into, I think it's like Docker exec running interactive shell name or container name, Docker toots, and what command I want to run. So I'm in, and now I want to edit the package JSON, and now I can because I added Vim. Does that make sense? But changing that, as I like to call it, the class, you have to generate a new instance of that class in order to use it. So, yeah. Anybody else? Cool. Well, hope this was helpful, and you know, if anybody's interested, we could talk about making this a little more production ready in the future.
I didn't know about the Docker debug.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for joining us. It was online. We actually had 6 viewers online more consistently. So thanks y'all. Sorry about the video. We will get that fixed before next time. But yeah, thanks again.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.